two women drank their last pint here before meeting a knife in the dark. They say the Ripper watched them from the corner, but the staff will tell you the real horror isn't in the bar. It's in the nursery upstairs. Shut the door behind you. No, properly. The latch is temperamental, and that November fog is crawling in like it owns the place. There. Sit yourself down by the hearth. The fire's been going since midday, and the stones hold the warmth like a promise. You'll take a porter, I expect. Something dark and fortifying. Here. This was brewed not 10 miles from Whitechapel, though the brewery's long gone now, same as most things from that time. Drink it slowly. Let the warmth settle into your bones. You'll need your wits about you for what I'm about to tell you. There's a pub in Spitalfields, still standing, matter of fact, corner of Commercial Street and Fournier Street, right in the shadow of Hawksmoor's Church. You'll have heard the name, probably. The 10 Bells. The journalists call it the most haunted pub in London. The tour guides call it the Ripper Pub, though that name came later, stuck like tar after the newspapers were done with it. For a few dark years in the 80s, some fool even renamed it the Jack the Ripper. Imagine that. Naming your establishment after the man who made your customers famous for dying. But the story I want to tell you tonight isn't about the Ripper. Not really. Oh, he's in it. Same as fog is in every street and gin is in every glass of that era. You can't tell the story of the 10 Bells without his shadow falling across it. But the true horror of that pub isn't what happened in Dorset Street or Miller's Court. The true horror is what happened every single night, long before the murders began and long after they ended. The 10 Bells was a waiting room. That's what you need to understand. A waiting room for death, dressed up in tile and mahogany and gaslight. Let me paint the picture properly, because the Spitalfields you imagine isn't the Spitalfields that was. You're thinking of the coffee shops and the vintage markets, the Georgian townhouses with their restored shutters and their 6-figure price tags. Forget all that. In 1888, Spitalfields was a slum so vile that even the rats looked underfed. The streets were narrow, the buildings pressed together like passengers in a third-class carriage. The courts and alleys ran off in every direction, each one darker than the last. Dorset Street, which the locals called the worst street in London, was barely a stone's throw from the 10 Bells door. And into those courts, into those alleys, into those stinking lodging houses with their 4-penny beds, came the dispossessed of the empire. Irish refugees from the famine, Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe, English workers priced out of every other parish, all of them packed together, fighting for scraps, dying by inches. The women had it worst. Always do, don't they? The factories wanted girls for the matchbox trade, the silk weaving, the fur pulling. Work that paid 4 pence a gross, work that poisoned your lungs and bent your spine and left you coughing blood before you turned 30. And when that work dried up, when the factories closed or the seasons changed, or your hands grew too stiff to hold a needle, there was only one trade left. The pubs were where it happened. Not the act itself usually, though God knows the back rooms saw their share, but the negotiation, the finding. A woman would stand at the bar of the 10 Bells, nursing a quartern of gin, and wait. The men who came through knew what they were looking for. Everyone knew. It was commerce, same as any other, and the 10 Bells was the marketplace. And what a marketplace it was. You have to understand what a gin palace meant to people who lived in the rookeries. Their rooms were dark, lit by tallow candles if they were lucky, thick with the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. But the 10 bells, the tiles on those walls, the cut glass mirrors, the polished brass, they caught the gaslight and multiplied it. The whole place glittered like a jewel box. It was designed that way, you see. The breweries knew what they were doing. They built the pub to be everything the slum home wasn't. Bright where the home was dark. Warm where the home was cold. Clean where the home was filthy. For the price of a quartern, you could stand in a palace and forget, just for a moment, that you'd be sleeping in a gutter by morning. Here's the calculation that breaks your heart, if you let yourself think about it. A quartern of gin, 2.5 pence to 5 pence depending on the quality. A bed in a doss house, 4 pence for the night. A woman earned 4 pence for her services, if she was lucky. Sometimes less. So picture it. November night, 1888. The fog sits on Commercial Street like a wet blanket. A woman stands at the gleaming bar of the 10 bells, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and stale beer and cheap tobacco and the press of unwashed bodies, and in her hand she holds enough coin for one choice. One. She can buy a bed and lie down safe and sober and cold. Or she can buy enough gin to forget the cold, forget the hunger, forget what she'll have to do to earn tomorrow's bed. She can be warm on the inside even as the night closes in around her. They chose the gin. Most of them chose the gin. Wouldn't you? The fire's crackling nicely now. Listen to it spit and hiss. That sound, that's moisture escaping from the wood. Everything lets go eventually, doesn't it? Everything gives up what it's holding. The women who drank at the 10 bells weren't monsters or saints. They were Annie Chapman, 47 years old, separated from her husband, dying of tuberculosis, drinking away the remnants of a respectable life. They were Mary Jane Kelly, 25, Irish, pretty enough that men paid extra. They were Elizabeth Stride and Mary Ann Nichols and all the others whose names you've never heard because nobody thought to write them down until they turned up dead. They stood at that bar under those famous tiles and they made their calculation. And the pub, that glittering gin palace with its etched glass and its mahogany counter and its murals showing Spitalfields in ye olden time. The pub took their pennies and poured their poison and watched them walk out into the dark. The tiles are still there, you know. That pastoral scene, shepherdesses and green fields and a world that never existed. Not in Spitalfields, not anywhere. A fantasy painted in ceramic, designed to make the drinkers forget where they were. To make them feel, for the price of a quartern, that they were somewhere clean and bright and safe. The irony is enough to choke you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The tiles and the gin, those came later. First, you need to understand what the 10 bells was before it became famous. Before the murders. Before the ghost stories. Before the tour groups and the podcasts and the journalists looking for a cheap thrill. You need to understand the bed in the attic and what they found behind the water tank. The 10 bells wasn't always called that. The name changed with the times, the way pub names do. Started out as the 8 Bells Ale House back in 1755, named for the peal in Hawksmoor's church across the street. When the church installed new chimes in 1788, numbering 10, the pub followed suit. The bells in the steeple have changed since then, up to 12 at one point, down to 8 after a fire, but the name stuck. The 10 bells. Some things calcify into the local tongue and refuse to budge, no matter what the reality says. For a while, in the late 20th century, it was the Jack the Ripper, though the locals never called it that, and the name was scrubbed away eventually when the tourism turned sour. Before that, before any of the horrors I'm about to describe, it was simply a Spitalfields boozer serving the silk weavers and the market traders. Honest enough work for an honest enough pub. But here's what the tour guides don't tell you. The building has layers, same as the city itself. And in those layers, in the attic rooms where the staff once slept, something happened that has nothing to do with the Ripper at all. You know what a Potman is? Was, I should say. The trade's mostly gone now. A Potman was the lowest rung on the pub ladder. He collected the empties, the heavy pewter pots that were only just giving way to glass. He swabbed the floors, cleared the sawdust that soaked up the spilled beer and the spitting. He hauled the barrels up from the cellar and threw out the drunks when they got too scammered to stand. In exchange, he got a few shillings a week and a bed in the attic. Not a room, mind you, a bed. Sometimes just a corner of a room, shared with the scullery maid or the cook's boy, the publican's household, all crammed together under the eaves like swallows in a barn. The legend says George Roberts was murdered in that attic. George Roberts, who ran the 10 Bells in the early 20th century, supposedly met his end with an axe to the skull, right there above the bar where the customers were drinking, and none the wiser. The ghost hunters love this story. They bring their equipment up those narrow stairs, their electromagnetic sensors and their infrared cameras, and they wait for George to make himself known. Staff have reported waking in those upper rooms to find the spectral figure of an old man in Victorian dress lying beside them in the bed. He vanishes when they scream. Here's the truth, and it's stranger than the lie. George Roberts did exist. He was a publican, and he was murdered with an axe, but not in the 10 Bells, not even in London. George Roberts met his end in a cinema in Swansea, hundreds of miles from Spitalfields, killed by a man with a grudge and nothing to do with the pub trade at all. The legend migrated. That's what legends do. Someone heard the name, heard the manner of death, and the story attached itself to the 10 Bells, like a barnacle to a hull. The pub needed a ghost, and George Roberts was available, so George Roberts became the ghost. Never mind that he never worked there, never slept there, never set foot in the place. The story was better than the truth, so the story won. But the figure in the bed, the presence in those attic rooms, that's likely something else entirely. Those were the Potman's quarters, you see. Generations of Potmans slept up there, lived and died in service to the pub. The ghost in the bed isn't the landlord come home. It's the servant who never left. And there is something else in that attic, something real. In the 1990s, during renovation work, a builder was sent up to check the water tank. Old building, old plumbing, the usual complaints about pressure and leaks. He shifted some boxes, cleared away decades of accumulated rubbish, and found a sack wedged behind the tank where no one had looked in a century. Inside the sack were baby clothes, Victorian by the cut of them. Tiny gowns and bonnets and swaddling bands, the sort of things a working family might have saved for a christening. They were mouldering, damp rotted, barely holding together, and they were slashed. Every single garment cut through with something sharp, not worn through, not torn by age, cut, deliberately, systematically, as if someone had taken a knife to them in a fury, or a grief, or something worse than either. The builder left them where he found them. Wouldn't touch them, wouldn't move them. Said the air up there went cold when he pulled back the sacking. Cold enough to see his breath, even though it was July. The renovation crew worked around that corner of the attic for the rest of the job. Nobody wanted to go near it. Those clothes are still there so far as anyone knows. Still behind the water tank. Still waiting. A psychic, visiting the pub years later, refused to enter that room. Sensed something, she said. The violent death of an infant. There's no police record to confirm it. No parish burial that matches. But infanticide was a grim reality of Victorian poverty. The last desperate act of women who couldn't feed another mouth. The slashed clothes are a memorial to something, or someone. The slaughter of the innocents echoing down through the years. Visitors to the upper floors report the sound of a baby crying. Not loud, not constant. Just a thin wail, distant and muffled, as if it's coming from behind a wall, or beneath a floor, or from somewhere that doesn't quite exist anymore. The Potman, who slept up there, whoever he was, would have heard it every night, would have pulled his blanket over his ears and tried to ignore it, would have told himself it was cats, or the wind, or his own tired mind playing tricks. The same lies we all tell ourselves when the dark gets too close. Now, let me freshen your glass before we go further. This next part is where the pub you've heard about finally enters the story. This is where the women come in. The autumn of 1888. The year London learned to be afraid of the dark. Annie Chapman drank at the 10 Bells. We know this because the witnesses said so, and because where else would she drink? Her lodging house was at Crossingham's on Dorset Street, a 3-minute walk from the pub's door. She was a regular. The barman knew her face, knew her order, knew the sound of her laugh before the gin turned it hoarse. She was dying already, was Annie. Tuberculosis eating away at her lungs. 47 years old and looking 60. But she was a fighter, right up to the end. The week before she died, she'd been in a brawl at the Britannia pub, just down the road. A proper scrap with a woman named Eliza Cooper. And you know what they were fighting over? A bar of soap. A bar of soap and a halfpenny. That's how tight the margins were. That's how little it took to turn neighbour against neighbour. The bruises from that fight were still visible on Annie's body when they laid her out for the autopsy. She went to her death already marked by violence. On the morning of Saturday, September 8th, she was turned out of her doss house because she couldn't make the fourpence for her bed. She'd spent it, or drunk it, or given it away. The records don't say. What they do say is that she told the deputy keeper, "Don't let my bed. I'll be back soon. I'll get the money." She walked out into Spitalfields to earn her fourpence. Witnesses place her at the 10 Bells around 5 in the morning, drinking, served by the landlord or his potman. A man in a little skull cap was seen calling for her. She left with him. She never came back. They found her at dawn in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, not half a mile from where we're sitting. The details don't bear repeating, and I wouldn't repeat them if they did. What matters is this. She'd been at the 10 Bells hours before, standing at that bar under those painted tiles with their fantasy of green fields and clean air, making her calculation. Gin or bed, warmth or safety. She chose warmth, and then she walked out into the cold, and the cold took her. Elizabeth Stride was another regular. Long Liz they called her, Swedish by birth, worn down by London. She'd been thrown out of the 10 Bells once for being too drunk, too loud, Too much trouble. The landlord had the right to refuse service, to maintain order, even in a place like that. Even the lawless East End had its limits. But she kept coming back. Where else was there to go? She died on the same night as Catherine Eddowes, the double event of September 30th. 2 women in one night. The streets weren't safe, everyone knew it, and still they went out. Still they made their calculation. Because the alternative was sleeping rough, or starving, or watching your children starve. Mary Jane Kelly was the last of them. The canonical 5, the papers called them, though God knows how many others went unremarked and unremembered. Mary Jane was different from the others. Younger, prettier. She had a room of her own, a single room in Miller's Court, which was practically luxury by Dorset Street standards. She didn't have to walk the streets every night. She could be choosy about her customers, but she still drank at the 10 Bells. Her door was directly opposite, a few yards across the cobbles. The pub was her local, her living room, her place of business. She still stood at that bar on the night of November 8th, 1888, chatting with the regulars, finishing her gin. Witnesses saw her leave around midnight with a man. Respectably dressed, they said, carried a parcel, walked with her toward Dorset Street, toward Miller's Court, toward that single room where she thought she'd be safe. They found her the next morning. What was left of her? The pub closed its doors that day. First time anyone could remember the 10 Bells shutting before last orders. The barman stood in the street with the locals, white-faced, silent. They'd served her. They'd watched her walk out. They'd done nothing, because there was nothing to do, because it happened every night and most of the time the women came back, and so you stopped worrying about the ones who didn't. The police came, of course, questioned everyone. The regulars, the barman, the Potman in his attic room. Nobody saw anything useful. Nobody ever did. The Ripper moved through Whitechapel like fog, and like fog, he left no footprints. But here's the thing that stays with me. The thing I think about when I look at those tiles, at that pastoral scene so carefully preserved. The women knew. They knew the streets weren't safe. They knew that something was out there hunting. The newspapers had been screaming about it for weeks. The whole East End was in a panic. Vigilance committees on every corner. Women walking in pairs when they could afford the company. And still, they went out. Still, they made their calculation. Because fear doesn't fill your belly, and neither does caution. Because the Doss House deputy wouldn't take promises, only pennies. Because 4p was 4p, and the rent came due every single night, whether there was a monster in the streets or not. The 10 Bells didn't create that desperation, but it profited from it. Every penny spent on gin was a penny not spent on shelter. Every hour at that bar was an hour closer to closing time, to the moment when a woman had to choose between the cold streets and the stranger's coin. The pub was a machine, you see. A machine for turning poverty into profit. The tiles on the wall, the etched glass, the mahogany bar polished to a mirror shine. All of it was designed to make the drinkers forget, just for a moment, how trapped they were. And then the moment ended, and the doors opened, and out they went into the dark. The fire's burning low. I can see you want to speak, want to ask questions. Save them for a moment longer. The worst is almost over, and then we can sit in the quiet and make sense of what we've heard, or try to, at least. Some stories don't make sense, no matter how long you sit with them. The murders stopped as suddenly as they'd started. November 1888, Mary Jane Kelly, and then nothing. Or nothing that fit the pattern at least. The police kept investigating for years, chasing shadows and false confessions, but the Ripper never struck again. He vanished into the fog he'd come from, and Whitechapel was left to bury its dead and carry on. The 10 Bells carried on too. What else could it do? The rent was due, the barrels needed changing, the customers kept coming. Within a year, the pub was back to its usual trade. The silk weavers and the costermongers, the market porters and the women who worked the streets. The same faces, the same calculations, the same thin line between a bed and a gutter. But something had changed. Not just in the pub, but in the city itself. The historian Jerry White put it best. Jack the Ripper did more to destroy the Flower and Dean Street rookery than 50 years of road building and slum clearance. The murders shamed respectable London into seeing what it had tried so hard to ignore. The Housing of the Working Classes Act followed in 1890, giving authorities the power to tear down the worst of the slums and build something better in their place. The streets where Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly had lived and died were razed within a generation. The 10 Bells survived. It had its license, its corner position, its famous tiles. It became a curiosity, then a destination. By the turn of the century, the first tourists were already arriving. Day trippers from the West End, slumming it in Spitalfields for the thrill. They'd stand at the bar and order a gin and look around with wide eyes, hoping to see something terrible, hoping to feel something. The locals learned to ignore them or to fleece them, depending on temperament. The barmen learned to tell stories, embellishing a little more each time. The ghost of George Roberts, murdered in the attic with an axe. The sound of a baby crying in the walls. The pale figure of a woman in Victorian dress, standing at the corner of the bar where Annie Chapman used to stand. The stories grew because stories always grow. Each generation added something new. By the 1970s, the 10 Bells had been renamed the Jack the Ripper, and the walls were covered with crime scene photographs and police sketches. Murder as decoration, suffering as ambience. They sold drinks called Ripper Tipples and traded on the blood of women who had once sought refuge there. It didn't last. The locals complained. The women's groups protested. A feminist organization called Reclaim the Night launched a sustained campaign against the pub's name. They argued, quite rightly, that naming a social venue after a serial killer of women was an act of erasure. It celebrated the perpetrator while silencing the victims. It turned murder into entertainment and profit. In 1988, the centenary of the murders, someone finally listened. The brewery ordered the name reverted to the 10 Bells. The photographs came down. The pub tried to become respectable again, tried to shake off the notoriety that had clung to it for a century. But you can't unring a bell. The 10 Bells was famous now, famous for death. And fame has a weight that presses down on a place until the floorboards creak with it. The ghost sightings increased. That's the strange part. You'd think that cleaning up the pub, taking down the murder memorabilia, would quiet whatever spirits lingered there. Instead, the opposite happened. More reports, more cold spots, more glimpses of figures in Victorian dress, standing in doorways or climbing the stairs to the attic. The crying infant became a regular occurrence. Staff would hear it during quiet afternoons, when the bar was nearly empty and the noise of the street faded to nothing. A thin, reedy wail, impossible to locate. impossible to explain. Some of them quit. Others learned to work with the radio on, loud enough to drown out anything they didn't want to hear. And the women, always the women. Visitors report seeing them at the bar, at the tables, in the corners where the gaslight used to flicker. They're never clear, never solid, just impressions. A bonnet glimpsed in a mirror, a shawl disappearing around a corner, the smell of cheap perfume and cheaper gin, there and gone in the space of a breath. Poltergeist activity too, they say. Gusts of cold wind when no window is open. Objects moving when no hand touches them. Some attribute it to Annie Chapman herself, still restless, still refusing to leave the scene of her last comfort. The mediums say they're trapped. The historians say their memory, imprinted on the building like a photograph on glass. The skeptics say they're nothing at all, just pattern-seeking brains making sense of shadows. I don't know what they are. I don't think it matters. What matters is that they're remembered. Annie Chapman, with her bruises from a fight over a bar of soap. Mary Jane Kelly, who lived close enough to hear the pub's last orders from her bed. Elizabeth Stride, thrown out for drunkenness one night, murdered the next. The others whose names we know and the hundreds whose names we don't. The women who stood at that bar and made their calculation and walked out into the dark night after night, year after year, until the dark finally took them. The tiles are still there. Spitalfields in ye olden time. Shepherdesses and green fields and a world that never existed. The pub has been renovated half a dozen times since 1888, but those tiles remain, protected now, heritage listed, too valuable to remove, too beautiful to destroy. I wonder sometimes if that's the cruelest irony of all. The women who drank beneath those tiles couldn't afford a bed for the night. Now the tiles themselves are worth more than those women earned in their entire lives. The fantasy outlasted the reality. The decoration outlasted the decorated. The fire's nearly out now. Just embers glowing soft in the ash. You can still feel the warmth if you hold your hands close, but it's fading. Everything fades eventually. Here's what I want you to take with you when you walk out into that night. The 10 Bells wasn't a haunted pub that became famous because of the Ripper. It was a haunted pub long before he arrived, haunted by poverty and desperation and the daily horror of lives ground down to nothing. The Ripper just made it visible. He held up a mirror to the East End and showed respectable London what it had been trying not to see. The women who died weren't victims of one man with a knife. They were victims of a system that gave them two choices: sell yourself or starve. The Ripper ended their lives, but the system had already taken everything else: their dignity, their safety, their hope. The pub profited from that system, took their pennies, poured their gin, watched them walk out into the dark. And when they didn't come back, it opened the next morning and did the same thing all over again. That's the real haunting, not the ghosts in the attic, not the crying infant behind the water tank, not even the women glimpsed in mirrors, forever standing at a bar that no longer exists as it was. The real haunting is the knowledge that it happened at all, that it was allowed to happen. That respectable society built its wealth on the broken bodies of women it refused to see. The 10 Bells is a memorial now, whether it wants to be or not. Every tourist who walks through that door, every ghost hunter who climbs those stairs, every journalist who writes another article about the Ripper pub, they're all paying tribute, not to the killer, to the killed, to Annie and Mary Jane and Elizabeth and all the others. To the women who made their calculation and lost, here's to them then. Raise your glass, if you've anything left in it. To the women of Whitechapel who deserved better than they got. To the ones who survived and the ones who didn't. To the ones whose names we remember and the ones whose names are lost forever. And here's to the price of a bed. 4pence in 1888. The cost of a life when you couldn't afford it. The night's clear outside. You can see the stars if you look past the street lamps. The fog's lifted, and the walk home should be easy. Easier than it was for them, at least. Easier than it ever was for them. Mind how you go. And if you're ever in Spitalfields, if you find yourself outside the 10 Bells on a November evening, take a moment. Look up at those windows. Think about what happened there, and what's still happening, in a way, every time someone tells the story. Some places don't let go of their dead, and some dead don't want to be let go of. They want to be remembered. They want us to understand what it cost them just to live, just to survive one more night. The fire's out now. Time you were on your way, safe home, and spare a thought for the ones who never made it. You've been listening to British Pub Law. Mind how you go.